Representative Bentley, members and guests of the Council, it's a pleasure to welcome you to another meeting of the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs. Substituting for the chairman of our Board of Trustees, who's not here, this evening will be his wife, Aurelia Bolton. So it's my special pleasure to introduce her. She's known to some of you as a member of the Board of Trustees of the Walters Gallery, as well as a variety of other notable public services, and has been a good friend and supporter of Representative Bentley. Mrs. Bolton.
Unfortunately for Perry, he's out of the country, but fortunately for me, it's a pleasure to be here and to introduce Helen, because we have been friends. I've been an admirer of Helen's for many, many years. Who would have thought almost 30 years ago that we would be here tonight in this magnificent World Trade Center with its breathtaking view of the Inner Harbor? Who would have dreamed that the Port of Baltimore could one day gain world-class status, becoming a sister city to other ports, or that such prestigious ocean liners as the QE2 would honor Baltimore as one of its ports of call? Only people who believe in the future and work to make it happen would have thought all of this possible. Only people like Helen Delich Bentley, who recognize the promise of the port and work to fulfill that promise, make these things happen. Over 30 years ago, Helen saw the need for a Maryland Port Authority and led the fight to establish one. Determined to see Maryland grow along with the port, Helen created a television show that promoted the port. For 15 years, she spread the word statewide about the port's impact on our economy. She wrote newspaper and magazine articles. She spoke about the port as Maryland's threshold to tomorrow, as its gateway to a thriving future of international trade. And when Helen speaks about the port and international trade, others listen. They listened when she served as chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission for 6 years, as a consultant in international trade, and now as Congresswoman from Maryland's 2nd Congressional District. Helen now speaks for us on 3 House committees: Public Works and Transportation, Merchant Marine and Fisheries, and the Select Committee on Aging. She serves on 7 subcommittees, including the Economic Development Subcommittee of the Public Works and Transportation Committee. This lets Helen wear her Promote the Port hat with pride. A member of our own Council on Foreign Affairs, the Honorable Helen Delich Bentley, will speak on Maryland in the international economy.
Thank you very much, Aurelia. Ladies and gentlemen, it is always good for me to be looking out over the Port of Baltimore, making an address on the Port of Baltimore. And I'm particularly pleased tonight to be here with the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs for a number of reasons. And the main reason, of course, is that so many of you are old friends. People that I've known going back to the time of my 24 years as maritime editor and reporter on the Baltimore Sun. And one person whom I was particularly happy to see here tonight, and Aurelia referred to the passing of the legislation through the General Assembly for the Maryland Port Authority then, and that's Dr. Millard Otanisek, right here. And I'll just tell you a little side story. After we lost the first time in 1955, and that legislation was turned down, Millie and I called each other up the next day and we said, we can't let it happen. She was an official member of the Governor's Committee. Governor McKeldin had appointed her, and I was an ex officio because I was in the newspaper business, so I could never belong to anything, you see. So Millie and I decided that that Saturday we were going to start things a-buzzing, and as Bill Boucher tells the story, he said, you called me up 7 o'clock on Saturday morning and told me to get out of bed and get downtown because we were starting a meeting. That phase of it I didn't remember, but he remembered well. Maybe Millie does. But that's really how we got the committee going again on, and to inspire the Maryland General Assembly to get the legislation through for the Maryland Port Authority. And it wasn't easy. As Aurelia said, I've been asked tonight to speak about the future of Maryland in the international economy. And when we talk about Maryland's economic future, whether it relates to domestic or international economy, it is absolutely essential that we mention the Port of Baltimore. And I'm not saying that just because I'm maritime-oriented. It's true that because of the many years I spent covering the Baltimore waterfront, and because of my subsequent appointment as chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission, that I tend to emphasize the subject. But let's face it, when we talk about the international economy, we have got to include international commerce. And this means we've got to talk about ports, which means, of course, that we must talk about the Port of Baltimore. Great seaports, like great ocean-going vessels, play a vital role in our nation's international commerce. And that means that we can never afford to forget that the Port of Baltimore is an essential link in the vast transportation network which girdles the United States and Canada and forms an equally effective transportation system with other great trading nations of the world. Baltimore is one of the truly great seaports of the world. And more important, it is the lifeblood of our state's economy. Most of you here tonight are aware of its economic importance, I'm sure. But we need to constantly remind others in our state that the port is our most important single economic asset. A 1980 study done for the Maryland Port Administration states that the port generates 79,000 jobs statewide, earning $1.2 billion in revenue for employers and port-related businesses, bringing $1 billion in personal income for Maryland residents, and $73 million in state and local taxes. So those are some very significant figures. And what that means, in essence, is that regardless of what kind of business each of you here today specializes in, you have a stake in the future of the port. Certainly, we all want to see the port prosper because it is a vital link in our complex and modern system of international trade. And its continued success and ability to compete is essential if Maryland is to have its share of the ever-growing international economy. We all know the need to dredge and deepen our main shipping channel to a 50-foot depth is essential to the port's continued viability. The Maryland congressional delegation is cooperating as they never have before to accomplish this goal. And officials of the Maryland Port Administration and the State Department of Transportation, including Transportation Secretary William Helen, are also giving this project top priority. The Department of the Army has opened up talks with the Maryland Port Administration, and the two sides presently are trying to work out the least expensive way to achieve that 50-foot depth, and at the same time to determine how much the federal government will pay and for how much the state government will be responsible. I was reminded here just before I began talking that, you know, Helen, we really can't use the 42-foot depth that was completed in the late 1960s because of silting in that has been allowed. So instead of the 42-foot depth, the pilots go for 39.5 feet. But the maintenance dredging for that is getting underway this year, and I can talk about that. Give me one of those blue bulletins out of there. And now, I have the story about the $15 million that we did get for dredging in my newsletter to my constituents, and there are copies of it over there. So the 42-foot depth will be reestablished within the next year. So that's very important. But we also have another channel problem, and that's only now beginning to get the necessary attention, and that's the limitation through the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal, the body of water which of course connects the Chesapeake and Delaware Bays. When the late Maryland Congressman George Fallon was chairman of the Public Works Committee, he succeeded in winning approval for a 35-foot depth and a 400-foot width through the C&D at a cost of about $105 million. That project was completed in 1968, but ships today are not able to use that 35-foot depth because of the rapid silting in of the channel on the Chesapeake side of the entrance. So the reasons that these dimensions are so necessary is that the growing container ships, which you will hear more about later, need at least a 35-foot depth if they are to use the shortcut between Baltimore and Philadelphia and New York. Without the shortcut, it is becoming increasingly difficult to persuade the high-cost vessels to make the trek up Chesapeake Bay from Cape Henry. But today, I think it is appropriate to consider other factors that are also important. Some of you may have been surprised, and to a degree disturbed, as I was, about an article that appeared in the April 4th edition of the Baltimore Sun. That article discussed the initiative by Governor Hughes, which was enacted by the state legislature to create a new international trade office which will be part of the state's Department of Economic and Community Development. The purpose of this new agency will be to assist Maryland businessmen in selling their goods and services abroad, and that's certainly a worthy goal. But the disturbing part about the news was the statement that Maryland now exports only 5.5% of its gross product. The national average is 8%. And the bottom line is that Maryland now ranks 45th among our 50 states in average per capita export value. And this is a 1984 figure. But let's state it another way. Maryland is among the 5 bottom states in foreign exports. Shocking? Maryland dropped from 32nd place in 1981 to 45th place last year. That's more shocking to me. And you ask, if the Port of Baltimore is one of the great seaports of the country, how can this be? Well, for one thing, we've got to look at the nature of the cargo that has traditionally flowed through our port. The state of Maryland has not been known for exporting its own products. Instead, it has served as sort of a filter, a gateway to the sea for other surrounding states that ship their cargo through our port. We must, of course, continue to compete for this out-of-state cargo, but it is also important to look for other ways to expand our port traffic. One provision of the bill enacted by the state legislature establishes a Trade Policy Council headed by the Lieutenant Governor with the responsibility for coordinating all the state agencies' efforts for international trade. Among other things, it will seek to encourage more exports of state agricultural products, including tobacco and poultry, and it will seek to lure other small Maryland businessmen into international trade. No one can quarrel with the goals set for this Trade Council, but I am puzzled about something that the state legislature did. It knocked out of the budget a provision which would give the Maryland Port Administration $200,000 for a special audio-visual promotional tool. This money would have been used to develop and produce an audiovisual orientation to present to potential port customers, small businessmen, steamship operators, etc., a sophisticated sales pitch on what the Port of Baltimore has to offer. I really don't understand this kind of thinking, especially in view of other press reports that the state intends to scrutinize more closely the sales and marketing procedure of the MPA. There's nothing wrong with monitoring this agency's procedures and policies. As a matter of fact, I think it makes good business sense. But I cannot understand the logic in denying this agency a marketing tool in this day and age that will help sell the port services. If the new Trade Council is going to expend time and money to induce small Maryland businessmen to venture into international trade, what's to prevent that new shipper from transporting his commodity by rail to the Port of Norfolk, especially if he is reached by Norfolk's marketing techniques? The lesson to be learned here is that we can never lose sight of the fact that the Port of Baltimore is the heart of Maryland's international trade network, and the port must be the focal point. The port must be given whatever tools it needs to market its services and to lock up any potential new business. There is a fierce competition today between ports for every pound of cargo. So what we need is total cooperation between all segments of the public and private sectors, and we certainly need total cooperation between the various state entities. The bitter competition that has developed among the ports in this age of deregulation is a major reason why the state of Maryland must do more to develop its own exports. And let me explain that statement. Since before the turn of the century, and when I first began my coverage of maritime activities here, I didn't do it at the turn of the century, but actually 40 years ago, and up through the late 70s, one of Baltimore's biggest advantages in drawing cards was the fact that it was closer to the Midwest than any other seaport, 150 miles from the Atlantic Ocean. And because of the regulated rail and truck rates, all cargoes moving from the Midwest could be shipped by rail or truck through the Port of Baltimore at a lower rate than through New York, Philadelphia, or Norfolk. Because of the vast volume of freight that moved naturally through Baltimore from the Midwest, ship owners never paid much attention to the cost of a ship coming into Baltimore. 150 miles up Chesapeake Bay because the ship then could exit through the C&D Canal or vice versa, or use the canal in both directions if she was not going to a southern port. Those advantages have been lost. With the age of deregulation of rail, railroads are able to assess equal freight rates to all of the Atlantic ports, or to make special rates for special cargoes to any port. As a matter of fact, Baltimore interests are still fretting over a large equipment movement last year to China that was given a lower rate through Hampton Roads by the Chessie system, when the freight literally had to move right through the Baltimore corridor from New York State. So with that rail rate advantage gone, and container ships entering the third generation, the daily cost of these sea giants is much greater, perhaps as much as $25,000 to $40,000 a day. Making a trip up Chesapeake Bay take on a new meaning and requiring a much closer study of the bottom line. And along with these economic changes, we now have ports advertising the fact, or opposing ports advertising the fact that Baltimore is farther away by 150 miles by ship. In other words, the ports have entered the age of competitive, no-holds-barred advertising, and we have to offset it. Our port administration has been striving to do just that, only this past week winning a national competition with its ad stating that every ship calling at the Port of Baltimore receives red carpet treatment. But all of this means that Baltimore interests must work much harder than ever if they are to retain business here. And this includes everyone from the longshoremen, the tugboat crewmen, the railroads, truckers, pilots, terminal operators such as the Maryland Port Administration, and so on. All costs are factored into that bottom line when it is studied and compared to competing ports, and decisions are made as to where the ships are going to call. Last August, 1984, the U.S. Department of Commerce issued various reports on exports by individual states, including Maryland. Unfortunately, the details and summaries are 3 years old. Actually, it was a 1981 figures, so it's really 4 years old now. But by looking at this Maryland export highlight, we know why Maryland can do better in the line of exports. Maryland's $1.2 billion worth of manufactured exports provided direct employment for an estimated 12,900 persons in 1981. Those jobs constituted 5.3% of the total manufacturing employment in the state. And from 1971 to 1981, the number of workers engaged in the production of manufactures was unchanged, while employment directly related to exports climbed by 39%. Very significant figures. In addition, an estimated 13,500 jobs were required in the state to manufacture products used by other establishments in the United States as inputs for manufactures that were ultimately exported. Thus, an estimated 26,400 jobs in Maryland were directly or indirectly dependent on the export of manufactured goods. And this number was 10.8% of all manufacturing employment in the state in 1981. 3/5 of the jobs dependent on manufactured exports were concentrated in the electronic equipment, primary metals, non-electric machinery, and chemical industries. These jobs accounted for 1 out of 5 jobs in the non-electric machinery industry, 1 out of 6 jobs in the primary metals and chemical industries, and 1 out of 8 jobs in the electronic equipment industry. An additional 37,400 jobs were generated in non-manufacturing industries that supply materials and services supporting manufactured exports. So Maryland's total manufacturing employment related to exports in 1981 amounted to 53,800 persons. That is even a more significant figure. And it's also estimated that Maryland's farm employment related to exports in 1982 amounted to 1 out of every 6 farmers. And this estimate assumes that the number of farmers dependent on exports corresponds to the ratio of exports to farm sales in the state. Depending on numerous variables, including the character of the product, mechanization, and degree of intensiveness of farming, it may somewhat understate or overstate the actual number of exports. In fiscal 1982, Maryland's share of U.S. agricultural exports totaled $188 million, 1.5 times the 1977 value. Feed grains and soybeans were the leading farm exports from the state. I do want to remind you all that the above figures I've been citing date back to 1981-82, when Maryland ranked 32nd in exports in the U.S. Remember, as I commented earlier, Maryland was 45th last year, which is why the establishment of this new division of the Maryland Economic Development Department is so vital. We all know that exports throughout the United States have plunged drastically in the past 24 months due to the high dollar and the intense competition from overseas. But that does not account for Maryland slipping 13 positions in the quantity of exports from this state. We also know that many small Maryland manufacturers have closed shop in the last 24 months due to the skyrocketing quantities of imports into the United States. Among these in my district are Misty Harbor Raincoats, which employed about 200 persons, and Arc Rod, which employed about 150. And one of my big concerns in the present Congress is the erosion of our entire industrial base as imports keep flooding this country. We are in a vicious circle whereby the high dollar is coming home to haunt our manufacturing industry at every turn. And you are all aware that this country has just suffered the worst balance of payments deficit ever in the past fiscal year, $123 billion. And we have become a debtor nation since the first time since 1914, before the First World War. So the future of Maryland in the international economy is affected by everything that Washington has done and will be doing. National taxing policy encourages the flight of manufacturing abroad, as it has also encouraged the registration of American ships abroad. We have created the ridiculous situation where it is now more profitable to destroy a plant, take a loss, than it is to create a new product and new production lines. What we need is to provide tax incentives to save companies rather than to destroy them and take a write-off. What you may have just heard may sound a little bit like gloom and doom. The facts are discouraging, but we can do something about them, both nationally and in the state of Maryland. For example, on the national level, we have been allowing a direct disadvantage of 46% on our exported commodities without really making an effort to change that around. Let me explain that statement. Because so many of the foreign countries exporting to the United States have a value-added tax rather than corporate income taxes or income taxes of any kind, they deduct the amount of the VAT when their commodity reaches their port for shipment overseas to the USA or another country. And according to Congressman Sam Gibbons, who heads up the vital subcommittee on trade of the Ways and Means Committee, VAT amounts to about 20% or more. And when that product then reaches the USA, we add only a minimum of the tariff, if any, because we believe in abiding by what was negotiated under GATT. We are honorable, and we believe in fair trade. On the other hand, Chairman Gibbons pointed out to the Export Task Force Committee, of which I am a member, there is no deduction of corporate taxes or any other kind of incentive when a U.S. product is exported. Therefore, the 20% disadvantage. And when our product reaches the other nation, very frequently, a tax or cost ranging up to 26% in one form or another is added on. It might be in the form of dissecting this product 3 times, such as Japan does, or a direct tax. But Chairman Gibbons emphasizes that each U.S. product has a 46% disadvantage over its competitor coming into this country. And certainly something can be done about that. And I'm going to urge the Export Task Force to do that something, or take some initiative on my own. And of course, the high dollar is hurting our export market at every turn. That is why it is so imperative to reduce the deficit in the budget this year. We have to get that high dollar down. And then looking at another aspect of it, and what are the laws and what can be done? We know that there are a lot of laws in place in regard to our trading picture, but I believe they need some tightening up in order to be more effectively used for American industry. Not only do our products suffer tax advantages in the high dollar, but over the last 20 years, we have seen unfair trading practices on the part of some of our GATT partners. Charges brought by injured manufacturers have been turned away by the free trade mentality of the executive branch. And to that end, I am planning to introduce an amendment to the 1974 Trade Act, which will give our industry the most direct access to relief possible. In what is commonly known as a 301 section of the 1974 Act, the discretionary power of the President decides which industries live and which industries die. The right to appeal unfair trade practices by another nation rests in 301. The problem here is that the relief is not mandatory. It is at the whim of the executive, which means that if granting the petitioner's application is in any way inconvenient to the geopolitical goals of that executive, the petitioner is out in the cold and maybe out of business. My amendment to the Trade Act will propose the following changes. If an American industry feels it has been injured by unfair trade practices by a foreign nation, the American company would file a petition with the Office of the Trade Representative. If the trade representative finds and rules that the American industry has been injured, that finding would automatically implement the mechanics for depriving the offending foreign nation of its investment tax credit and stop shipment of the offending product into this country. The President of the United States would be empowered to lift this sanction by executive order, if he so desires. In other words, he would be able to prevent the loss of tax credit to that nation, but it would require a deliberate overt act by the President. Because I want to have the strongest teeth possible in this bill, I'm not quite ready to introduce it, but will be within the next 2 weeks. I believe the American people, once educated to what is happening to their tax dollars, will begin to demand a change in our self-destructive foreign trade policy. I am doing my best to spread the word, to help in this education process. I say it's about time to start spending more American tax dollars here at home instead of abroad. It's time to reinvest in America. And of course, this means reinvesting in Maryland as well. Regardless of what happens on the national scene, we in Maryland should have one goal for the immediate future. That is to regain our national rank of 32nd in the quantity of exports from this state. Make that a goal for the next 12 months. And the following 12 months, we should aim to boost ourselves up to the 25th place. That would indeed bode well for Maryland and its residents. That would put people to work, stimulate the economy, and put even more people to work. And it would help the country as well. We all know that Maryland has much to offer the business community. And before I close, I want to point out another one of our great advantages is the Washington-Baltimore corridor. This is one of the largest metropolitan marketplaces in the world, the 5th largest in the nation to be exact. It's a market that a lot of firms, both domestic and foreign, wish to penetrate. So by joint venturing or subcontracting with foreign and domestic companies, local companies here in Baltimore can create more jobs for Marylanders as they have. For example, a company called Industrial Fabricators of Dundalk got more jobs when it subcontracted to a Swiss firm, Pantex Steel, to fabricate the steel girders used to support the walls in the Montgomery County section of the Washington Metro subway section. Pantex Steel had developed a system for digging tunnels 3 to 5 feet at a time, erecting a web of steel girders and blowing concrete between them. Pantex wanted to sub an American firm to fabricate the steel girders. Through the office of the Economic Development Council of Greater Baltimore, Pantex was put in touch with industrial fabricators, with the result being more jobs for residents in the Baltimore area. And another asset that impresses business is our superb transportation and trade facilities. Thanks to our outstanding network of highways, almost 34% of the U.S. population can be reached within an overnight's drive. 184 million tons of cargo was shipped through BWI last year, with a record number of 5.3 million passengers boarding flights. And as the Port of Baltimore continues to modernize its facilities, making it more attractive to international trade, the potential is for another 3 million tons a year to be handled through the expansion of South Locust Point and the opening of Seagirt in 1987. And I might point out that the Port of Baltimore is the only East Coast port with a new container terminal under construction. And we have down at Fort Holabird a new foreign trade zone which allows small industry to come in there and manufacture, and either for importing or exporting without paying tariffs. This provides jobs in this area. We have recently succeeded in getting Sparrows Point made as a subzone, foreign trade zone, so they can bring in foreign parts if necessary to reflag foreign flag ships down there. But what we need to do more than ever is to encourage local manufacturers to export more of their products, utilizing the outstanding trade and transportation facilities we do have available. For example, we need to identify local firms that are not producing to capacity but could do so if they had a market. These companies could be put in touch with foreign markets in South America, for instance, to which they might sell their goods, benefiting both economies. And here's just another example of what's happened on the plus side here. When General Motors decided to build the new Chevy minivan at Broning Highway plant, it chose to keep its inventory down to 2 days. Very important today. This meant that suppliers had to cluster around the Baltimore metropolitan area, bringing again more jobs here. So this is what that decision by GM management meant to this area. Hoover Universal, manufacturers of car seats for the minivan, located in Harford County. Monarch Molders, manufacturers of plastic parts for dashboard panels, located in Harford County. And on another count, PPG Industries, the world's largest manufacturer of flat glass and industrial coatings, is going to build a Baltimore facility to supply paint products for these new small vans. So we need to continue to encourage management techniques like GM that create more jobs locally. Oh yes, as I have said, all of this is more important than ever in this age of deregulation if we want to help the Port of Baltimore thrive. This would represent the kind of captive cargo that would move only through our port, the kind of captive cargo that still keeps New York going. I know that we can do it. I hope that you'll agree with me. We must put our shoulder to the wheel, sacrifice some, improve productivity, and make things hum. Then we can spread the word. Thank you very much. What Dr. Liu was just pointing out that on a visit to Japan, it was brought to her attention that many of the items that Americans export to Japan are items that don't fit with the Japanese economy, such as the cars drive on the wrong side of the street, that the size of dishwashers we send over there are too large for Japanese homes, and even the Coca-Cola bottles are too big for them. They like smaller ones. I have heard that same thing before, too, that our furniture, for instance, some of the furniture that we have tried to export in the past fits U.S. size rooms, but the size of rooms in Japanese homes are smaller than ours, and so it doesn't fit. There are many areas that our exporters must get work with the Japanese and with other countries. However, we do know this, that when some of our cars have gone to Japan, and other items too, they do strip them apart, literally taking them apart, and then putting them back together by hand, which in turn raises the cost substantially of that automobile, and that's their way of not adding a tariff but adding a cost to it. And that is one of the problems that's really a very bitter problem in these trade negotiations between Japan and the United States. My rationale for voting for the MX missile. Well, number one, I'm a supporter of strong defense in this country. Number two, we have a couple of industries in the 2nd District which are participating in its manufacture. I'm interested in jobs. And number three, this was a very crucial vote at a time with negotiations going on in Geneva, and we certainly shouldn't back down at that time, if ever. Where did I get my statistics on Maryland's placement, 32nd and 45th? I think it's per capita. And this is U.S. Department of Commerce figures. The question concerned Amtrak and what would happen to our airports and highways, the congestion, if Amtrak was cut. Well, Amtrak survived the Senate last week, so I think Amtrak will survive the House of Representatives. So we won't have to face that one. Not this year. I happen to be a strong supporter of keeping our rail system alive. Here again, I think it's a defense measure. And in times of emergency, we will need that for our logistics, for movements, as well as other forms. This question concerned Nicaragua. I did vote for funds for the Contras, and I will vote for them again.
How can you justify voting for that?
I don't think they are, but the important thing is that Nicaragua poses in Central America the spread of communism, as did Cuba. And if they did not have the Contras to keep them busy, we would have that communism going into other Central American countries very rapidly. And that is what I'm concerned about, because Central America is like a tinderbox today. And it could become communist very rapidly. I plan to go down there in August. I've had a lot of communication with people from Central America, and I am concerned about it down there. It is important to this country. Well, the question is concerning my urging of small manufacturers to get in the export market, and if the Small Business Administration is dissolved, what effect that would have on the small manufacturers, am I right? The Small Business Administration, part of it is going to remain intact. The part of it that has been most successful over the years of providing guarantees. I think it's important when you're looking at the whole picture of the Small Business Administration that over 70% of the direct loans that were made went bad. The businesses failed.
In what period?
Over the last...
Back too far.
No, not going back too far. And that's a high figure for failures. That's one of the reasons why it was targeted. However, enough of it is going to be there to help those persons along or those companies along who just need another shot in the arm to be successful. And on the matter of exporting, the Department of Commerce does provide a lot of assistance in helping small companies get going. And we do have a Commerce Department office right here in the Baltimore area, which is very helpful and very knowledgeable. I think the question, in summary, was instead of spending so much money on armaments directly, of spending it in other ways to develop services to help humans and directly throughout the world. Well, the United States, I think, has been very generous in expending funds historically to help others throughout the world. We just passed an $800 million fund to help the starving Ethiopians and the people in East Africa. So I don't think we have been have neglected that aspect at all. We have been very generous in providing grain cargoes and foodstuffs to many third world countries, and never expecting any return of or any payment on any of these. So I don't think we are neglecting that at all. I do think it is time for some of the other countries to perhaps do at least half of what we do to help these countries. Many of them whose economies are even better than ours today, but they don't lift a finger to help others elsewhere. The question is whether Maryland should develop its biotech industry further, and whether this could serve as an item for export and be of assistance. I'm going to be very honest with you. I'm not that totally knowledgeable on the high-tech industry. I have one of my staff people who's much more knowledgeable on it than I am, Pat Waite, in the back there. But I'm concerned about our exporting too much of our knowledge in the high-tech area overseas. And whether that takes in some of what you're talking about or not, I am concerned about that we are exporting it, that these other countries are taking it, they're using it to their advantage and to our disadvantage and running away from us. And that is of concern to me. The question concerned or pointed out that the Smoot-Hawley Trade Act, when it was passed in the 1920s, I believe, wasn't it 20s? 29. Was one of the biggest mistakes that this country ever made. And perhaps we need to, is there anything between that and free trade, as we know it today, that could protect our industries and still export? Well, I'm glad you brought that up. Only last week, I met with Ambassador Bill Middendorf, who is a Baltimorean. He's been the ambassador to the Organization of American States for the past 4 years, and he's going to become our ambassador to the European community very shortly. And he was pointing out that until the last 3 or 4 months, he seldom heard the word trade mentioned by anybody in Congress other than those few people who sat on a trade committee. But because of everything that's developing with our industries, people laid off, manufacturing going down, imports on the rise, and this sharp deficit in our balance of trade, that seldom a day goes by that you don't have a half a dozen or more persons in Congress get up on the floor and talk about trade. And they are getting angry about it. They are getting upset about it. And I am afraid that if something is not done on a voluntary basis, that there might be some reactionary legislation passed. And that is a real possibility today. For example, when the automobile restrictions were lifted on Japanese automobiles coming in, in January, I believe, the numbers were about 1,850,000 automobiles a year at that time. They had agreed then to, they said they would go up to 2,300,000, and only today we heard that the figure is going to be probably almost double of what that 1.8 million was when the barriers were lifted. Now that could trigger some adverse legislation. And the mood is there. The mood is there.
Would you support that?
I'm not sure what I would do at this point, I'll be honest with you. Well, I think the question concerned whether we should not try to negotiate with these countries rather than to erect protectionist barriers. I think people would prefer negotiating, and this is what the president's course was laid out on. But let's take voluntary steel imports. When the mood of Congress last year was to limit steel imports because we had reached up to as much as 33% of our steel was being imported last year. The White House said, don't pass any laws, I'll do jawboning. I will get them down to 18.9%. The steel industry said, okay, 18.9% would be acceptable. We could live with that. Well, this is now May. 6 months later, 7 months later. And I think you'll find the steel imports are around 24, 25%. So they have not voluntarily cut down. And I do know that Ambassador Bill Brock, when he was in negotiations with them, found them very reluctant to agree to any reductions at all. And that's part of the problem. And that's why you're having this wave of protectionist, this protectionist feeling. Instead of talking about boxes, grains, etc., what did the QE2 do for us? Well, the QE2 brought a lot of money into this area that we wouldn't have had otherwise. I think about $1.5 million were spent here, or maybe more. On the other hand, she picked up a revenue of about $5 million, so she didn't do too bad, but we got a piece of the action. We got over 20% of it. So that helps, plus all the publicity, that good publicity, positive publicity, that the Port of Baltimore can accommodate a vessel like that the people will go on a vessel like that our travel agents can fill her up. And I think all of those are pluses, and hopefully we'll get more of those ships in. The question is, what will be done about quality control? And our questioner went on to point out that one of the reasons that many of the Americans buy foreign goods is that the American goods are not of the highest quality, in essence, right? I think that there is a complete turnaround in that. I think that the attitude of the American worker worker is much more positive on that. They're much more interested in turning out a good product. There was no doubt shoddiness in the American automobiles for a long time. Thank goodness I was not one who got a bad car. I've always bought American cars. But the mood has changed among the workers. And as they say, it's an ill wind that doesn't blow some good. And probably the pressure that was put on over the years of the imports and that has helped in changing the attitudes. But you see this in union contracts where the unions have, in many cases, have cut back on their hourly wage. They've agreed to that. They've changed their work rules, etc., to improve productivity. So the attitude is changing, and for the better. It's worth exploring. The questioner pointed out that he regretted the institution of an embargo on trade with Nicaragua on the premise that all of the embargoes that have been issued by our country have always backfired on the U.S. exporters, which has been true in the grain embargo, the pipeline embargo, etc. And he hoped that something could be done to lift that embargo from Nicaragua, although he did point out that he supports aid to the Contras. And on the other item, on instituting some sort of a tax or refund to U.S. manufacturers similar to what the foreign manufacturers receive in the form of a VAT, that doing that rather than passing any negative legislation would be of more benefit. And that's what I was talking about when I said I hope the Export Task Force will do something along that line. Thank you very much.
Representative Bentley, I know that all of us here are appreciative of your taking your time to be with us today, for your careful analysis, your sound policy proposals, and perhaps most of all, your extraordinary spiritedness. Thank you very much.